It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. This week, the Prime Minister admits he did attend a drinks party in Downing Street during the first lockdown.
I regret the way the event I have described was handled. I bitterly regret it and wish that we could have done things differently. And I have and will continue to apologise for what we did.
But the Labour leader says he should quit.
When the whole country was locked down, he was hosting boozy parties in Downing Street. Yes. Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
We've driven the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, one of the fastest in the world. That is the work, Mr. Speaker, that has been going on in number 10 Downing Street.
Nearly 5 years after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, Michael Gove says house builders must pay to remove flammable cladding.
To those who missold dangerous products like cladding or insulation, to those who cut corners to save cash as they developed or refurbished people's homes, and to those who sought to profiteer from the consequences of the Grenfell tragedy, we are coming for you.
And the COVID disruption facing schools in Northern Ireland leads to this row in Stormont.
This pan-nationalist front signing this motion has sought to criticise for political advantage.
All children in Northern Ireland are affected, so don't try and turn something as fundamental as children's education into a sectarian argument.
Hello and welcome. Let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, as we saw in the headlines, the big row in Westminster this week has again been over parties in Downing Street. What happened this week?
Yes, Joe, you're absolutely right. Now, just before Christmas and the Christmas break, we had a big row about a party that had taken place in Downing Street in December 2020 when there were tight COVID restrictions in place. But this week, the row was focused on a party that took place in May 2020, a drinks party in the garden of Downing Street at a time when the country was under very tight lockdown restrictions. You could only meet one other person from outside your household, and that had to be outdoors in a public place. Lots of people had relatives in hospitals or care homes that they were not allowed to visit. And of course, as the pandemic continued, people were having to have funerals for loved ones where only a few people could sit in socially distanced pews. So all very tight restrictions, this revelation that civil servants and officials have been invited to a bring your own booze party in the garden at number 10. So the start of the week, Labour wanted to hear from Boris Johnson. The party's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, standing in for Keir Starmer, who at that point was isolating because of COVID, had tabled an urgent question in the Commons. She wanted Boris Johnson to come and make a statement. A lot of Labour MPs turned up, not that many Conservatives. When the person who stood up at the dispatch box turned out to be a junior minister, the Paymaster General, it got very noisy and there were lots of shouts of, "Where is he?"
I apologise again, unreservedly, for the upset that these allegations have caused. The Prime Minister has asked for an investigation to take place, and the terms of reference for the investigations that are underway have already been published.
It's quite obvious it is not the Prime Minister, so we don't need to keep asking that question. So please, can I hear what the Minister's got to say? He's got the tough job as it is. Don't make it harder for him. Come on, Minister.
The terms of reference set out that where there are credible allegations relating to other gatherings, it is open for those to be investigated. And I can confirm to the House, Mr. Speaker, that this includes the allegations relating to the 15th and 20th of May 2020. And if wrongdoing is established, there will be requisite disciplinary action taken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question, and it is incredibly disappointing but not unsurprising that the Prime Minister, of whom I asked this question, is not here today, despite not having any official engagements. And I think, Mr. Speaker, his absence speaks volumes, as does his smirks on the media. The public have already drawn their own conclusions. He can run, but he can't hide.
Why can't all the dirty linen be washed at once? Why are we getting this drip, drip feed of parties? Surely the civil service must have known that there was a party on the 20th of May, and they should have referred that already to the inquiry.
My mum, loved mum, died of COVID in March 2020. She died alone in hospital while I sat in the car outside trying to be as close to her as I could. Even burdened with our grief, my family obeyed the rules. Just 3 days after the Downing Street party, we marked a solemn Eid, the first without my lovely mum. Mr. Speaker, when asked by Sky News about the parties, the Prime Minister did little but smirk and laugh.
Shame. In Northern Ireland, we reached a milestone of 3,000 deaths due to COVID just last week. 3,000 people who followed the rules and grieved today. So will the paymaster, including my mother-in-law who died alone, will the Paymaster General confirm that there will be a full and complete disclosure to enable the police service to ascertain that all was done decently and within the regulations at the date and at that time? I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker.
Emotional scenes in the House of Commons, Sean. Then on Wednesday, we finally did hear from the Prime Minister himself.
That's right. I think it was inevitable that the Prime Minister was going to have to say something about this. And in the run-up to PMQs, as we were preparing, the word went round that Boris Johnson was going to make some sort of statement right at the start of question time, really to head off the inevitable questions of, well, were you at this party on the 20th of May? And I think everybody knew that the Prime Minister couldn't get through half an hour by simply saying, well, you'd have to wait for the inquiry. So there's a sort of formula to Prime Minister's questions. The first question is always about the Prime Minister's day. He's asked to list his engagements. And so before he got into the cut and thrust of question time, before he gave an answer to that question even, the Prime Minister set out a statement about what had happened in May 2020.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules. And though I cannot anticipate the conclusions of the current inquiry, I have learned enough to know that there were things we simply did not get right. And I must take responsibility. Number 10 is a big department with the garden as an extension of the office, which has been in constant use because of the role of fresh air in stopping the virus. And when I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May 2020 to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event. But, Mr. Speaker, with hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside. I should have found some other way to thank them. And I should have recognised that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way, people who suffered terribly, people who were forbidden from meeting loved ones at all, inside or outside. And to them and to this House, I offer my heartfelt apologies.
So, Sean, that was the Prime Minister's statement. As you say, it preceded the questions that then followed from Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. Yes, it's a case of the defence had got its word in first. So he got the chance to put that statement out before he was going to be asked any questions. So Keir Starmer, he got 6 questions, of course, an opportunity for quite a lengthy cross-examination, and it was clear from the start that he was less than impressed with what he'd just heard.
Well, there we have it. After months of deceit and deception, the pathetic spectacle of a man who's run out of road. His defence that he didn't realise he was at a party. It is so ridiculous that it's actually offensive to the British public. He's finally been forced to admit what everyone knew, that when the whole country was locked down, he was hosting boozy parties in Downing Street. Yes. Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
I want to repeat that I thought it was a work event, and Mr. Speaker, I regret very much that we did not do things differently that evening, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, and I take responsibility and I apologise, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer. This just isn't working, Prime Minister. No. Everyone could see what happened. Exactly. It started with reports of boozy parties in Downing Street during lockdown. The Prime Minister pretended that he had been assured there were no parties. Yeah. How that fits with his defence out, I do not know. Exactly. Then the video landed, blowing the Prime Minister's first defence out of the water. So then he pretended he was sickened and furious about the parties. Now it turns out he was at the parties all along. Can't the Prime Minister see why the British public think he's lying through his teeth?
Prime Minister, it was what the public think, not what a member is saying. That's Order. And I certainly don't need any help from round here. If somebody wants to help me, they can help somewhere else. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's up to the right honourable gentleman to choose how he conducts himself in this place. He's wrong. He's wrong. I say to him that he is wrong. He is wrong in what he has said. He said what he is wrong what he said is wrong in several key respects. But, Mr. Speaker, that does not detract from the basic point that I want to make today, which is that I accept that we should have done things differently on that evening. As I've said to the House, I believe that the events in question were within the guidance and were within the rules, and that was certainly the assumption on which I operated.
Mr. Speaker, so we've got the Prime Minister attending Downing Street parties, a clear breach of the rules. We've got the Prime Minister putting forward a series of ridiculous denials which he knows are untrue, a clear breach of the ministerial code. That code says ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation. The party's over, Prime Minister. The only question is, will the British public kick him out, will his party kick him out, or will he do the decent thing and resign?
Mr. Speaker, I just want to repeat that I think that the right honourable gentleman, I know that it is his objective and he's paid to try to remove me from office, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that and I accept that. But may I humbly suggest to him that he should wait until the inquiry has concluded. It is thanks to the efforts of this government that we have the most tested population in Europe, with 1.25 million tests being conducted every day. We've been working to ensure that this population, our country, has the most antivirals of any country in Europe. And, Mr. Speaker, it's because of the efforts of the government, of officials, of staff up and down Whitehall, that we've driven the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, one of the fastest in the world, and that is the reason, Mr. Speaker, that we now have one of the most open economies, if not the most open economy in Europe, and one of the fastest growing economy, Mr. Speaker, in the G7. And, Mr. Speaker, whatever the mistakes that have been made on my watch, for which I apologise and which I fully acknowledge, that is the work, Mr. Speaker, that has been going on in number 10 Downing Street.
Well, in that sort of cross-questioning by Keir Starmer, we heard the Prime Minister refer to the inquiry that is being led by Sue Gray. She's the senior civil servant who has the unenviable task of investigating lockdown parties. And we may hear quite shortly from her. What are we actually expecting to hear?
Yeah, it was an interesting moment, or series of moments during Prime Minister's questions, because Keir Starmer was the first opposition MP to call on him to resign, but in the end, 8 opposition MPs called on the Prime Minister to resign. And to all of them, he said, well, wait until we get this inquiry report, kind of raising the prospect or suggesting that perhaps he might resign if this report came out. Very few people think that that's likely. This is a report that was originally supposed to be carried out by the head of the civil service. He had to step aside after it was alleged that one of these events in December had taken place in his office. And so Sue Gray was appointed as a senior civil servant. So she is going to be asked to set out the facts, set out what actually happened. And then she'll report back to the Prime Minister, who, after all, appointed her. Now, we heard Keir Starmer there talking about the ministerial code. One of the complaints or the points that Labour was making on Thursday was, well, the ultimate judge and jury in cases of the ministerial code is the Prime Minister. So it's not at all clear exactly what we're going to hear when this report comes out. Boris Johnson did suggest, though, that he would come back to the Commons and he would be willing to be questioned about that report again. So we may get another high-octane moment in the Commons where he faces a serious challenge once that report is published. But most people think that that's a report that's going to just simply set out this is what has happened, and it's not going to be like a judge-led inquiry or some sort of completely independent investigation.
Sean, thank you for the moment. We'll be back with you shortly. The Scottish Parliament is now back from recess, and we can speak to our correspondent Andrew Kerr, who is there. Hello to you, Andrew. It's a new year, but COVID-19 continues to be a big issue in Holyrood. What happened this week?
That's right, Joe. It's been a week of coverage about parties, and let me tell you, there were far fewer parties in Scotland in the new year that has just passed. Nicola Sturgeon has put in much stricter restrictions when it comes to COVID compared to what you experienced down south. She's clamped down on parties and big gatherings. A maximum of 3 households can meet up together. Big events limited to 500 spectators only. Now, of course, Edinburgh's Hogmanay was cancelled, and of course it means people can't go to the football. But better news this week from the First Minister. Nicola Sturgeon was saying Scotland appears to be turning a corner. We had been expecting that tsunami of COVID cases, maybe 50,000 cases per day, but that hasn't materialised. So, better news indeed. Big events can go ahead from Monday, but the current rules for hospitality, such as table service for alcohol in bars, well, they remain in place until the 24th of January at least. So, as we learn to live with COVID, in a statement to Holyrood on Tuesday, the First Minister was looking at the possible extension of vaccine passports.
As we do lift these other protective measures, it will be necessary to consider again if extending the scope of COVID certification to other venues might be a necessary protection. To be clear, we have not yet taken any decisions on this, and it will require careful judgment, but I want to be clear to Parliament today that it is something we feel bound to give appropriate consideration to.
The First Minister says we need to learn to live with COVID. But after 2 years, people across Scotland have already learned to live with COVID. By now, people understand what's necessary to combat the virus. We have to trust their judgment. And that's why it's so disappointing to see the Scottish Government again looking to extend their vaccine passport scheme. Scottish businesses, Scottish jobs and our economy are set to be hit harder, even though the data is more positive. The SNP government have accepted there is no evidence that the vaccine passport scheme actually stops or reduces the spread of the virus.
Presiding Officer, I'm very concerned that the use of vaccine certification is set to continue, not least because it doesn't show venues who is sick and who is well. I'm also concerned about their wider rollout to a new array of venues, particularly when many of those venues are pulling themselves off the mat from following the latest hospitality curbs. I'm also concerned that with just 5 days notice, big sporting events are going to nearly need to treble their checking capacity, leading potentially to bottlenecks and safety concerns that they have already raised with this Parliament.
Well, Joe, a lot of opposition there, but the First Minister came back saying if people are indeed vaccinated when they go into these high-risk, crowded areas, it does indeed lower the risk of them being hospitalised.
Right, Andrew, but at First Minister's questions, the impact of COVID on the health service was another concern raised by Labour.
That's right, Joe. So we're maybe looking at a better picture in one sense, but of course the health service is still struggling. And Anna Sawar, the Scottish Labour leader, brought that up indeed at First Minister's questions. And he was saying the NHS didn't need just a recovery plan, but a recovery plan for 14 years of SNP government, as he put it. He was saying that there are 650,000 people on waiting lists in Scotland for operations. 60,000 of them have been waiting for more than a year, he was pointing out. Mr Sawar was also asking if one health board, that's NHS Lanarkshire, had been turned into an emergency-only service. So the First Minister, of course, was speaking about the impact of COVID on the health service and of the successive ways that we've seen of the Delta variant, of the Omicron variant too. But Mr Sawar was questioning if there was indeed an adequate recovery plan in place.
Nicola Sturgeon wants to pretend that all the problems in the NHS are because of the pandemic. But she has been in government for 14 years and she's been First Minister for 7 years. The NHS was under-resourced and undervalued by this government before the pandemic. Presiding Officer, patients are suffering, staff are burnt out. Isn't it the case that we don't just need a recovery plan from COVID, we need a recovery plan from 14 years of this SNP government?
I don't for a second suggest that all of the challenges faced by the National Health Service are down to the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the NHS was dealing with changing demographics, with the impact of technology. All of that was putting a pressure on the National Health Service, and we stood here and had exchanges on that then. I think, though, it is the case that Anna Sawar seems to try to deny the significant impact that COVID has had and is having on the National Health Service. If you take just over the most recent period as it's been dealing with Omicron, there's been a 65% increase in COVID-related staff absences in the National Health Service. That's the kind of pressure the NHS is dealing with.
Nicola Sturgeon responding there to claims by Anna Sawar about difficulties in the health service that preceded COVID. Moving away from the issue of the pandemic and the health service, Andrew, there's also been a big row about local government funding.
Yes, a thorny issue of local government funding. It's an annual battle as they fight for their allocations, of course. Now, an issue like this doesn't perhaps hit the headlines in a sense in the way that we've been seeing with COVID restrictions, but it's important, nevertheless important for people, depending on these all-important services that councils, of course, deliver. So this is the burden of the song from local government. In a sense, they say that they feel the budget that is allocated to them is not big enough. Now, they point out the Scottish Government is not raising income tax, but they have reinstated the ability to raise council tax once again after that famous freeze in Scotland. So, in essence, local authorities feel the Scottish Government is passing the buck to them. Now, the Local Government Committee met in Holyrood this week, and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, that's the umbrella group, had this to say to the Finance Secretary.
I've never seen leaders as angry as they were at our special leaders meeting when we were going through the figures for the settlement and obviously the relaxation around council tax. It was unanimous. Every council leader of all political persuasions were really deeply disappointed in this settlement because, as I say, when we factor in all the additional ring-fenced pressures that we're going to have to deal with, it makes it a very challenging landscape. And I think the anger was even more that the Scottish Government have the ability to raise income tax themselves and chose not to. And what they've essentially done is pass the buck to local government to fill that funding gap because there wasn't sufficient funding within the block grant and within the settlement. So I think there's a real anger there amongst leaders that the pressure is now being put on them to make very difficult decisions locally.
Like I have to take or make tax decisions that reflect the particular challenges facing households, that reflect our particular budget needs, I would expect local authorities to do likewise, taking into account some of the burdens on households right now, but also the need to fund local services.
So, tough decisions to be taken at local and national level. Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, was also adding that anything more than a 3% rise in council tax would indeed be unpalatable for people, especially as the so-called cost of living crisis starts to bite. Jo.
Thank you, Andrew. We're going to leave Holyrood for now. Let's catch up again with Sean. Another very big and long-running issue in Westminster. We heard in the headlines there a statement from Michael Gove, the relatively new Housing Secretary, and it was about the flammable cladding issue on buildings and who should pay to remove it. What did he say?
Yeah, well, you're right, Jo, this was a big announcement. It's an attempt by Michael Gove to draw a line under this very long-running row that's been running ever since the Grenfell fire tragedy in 2017, when in the wake of that it emerged that thousands of buildings had unsafe material on the outside. This was an announcement that has been quite heavily trailed, and so a lot of MPs kind of knew what the Minister was going to say. So even before it started, there was a bit of a row with the Speaker, because he was really annoyed that it had been in the Sunday papers. Michael Gove, interestingly, promised him that there'd be a leak inquiry. But then we got on to the big news, which was the announcement. And that is basically that he wants developers to pay. He's given them a deadline of March. They've got to find £4 billion by then. He's threatened that if they don't come up with the money, that there might be new taxes or a change in the law. And there was also a promise that leaseholders who live in medium-sized buildings, that's buildings that are between 11 and 18 metres tall, would no longer have to take out loans to pay for the work to make their homes safe.
Leaseholders are shouldering a desperately unfair burden. They're blameless, and it is morally wrong that they should be the ones asked to pay the price. I'm clear about who should pay the price for remedying failures. It should be the industries who profited as they caused the problem and those who continue to profit as they make it worse. Today, I'm putting them on notice. To those who missold dangerous products like cladding or insulation, to those who cut corners to save cash as they developed or refurbished people's homes, and to those who sought to profiteer from the consequences of the Grenfell tragedy, we are coming for you.
He'll also know that there's a gaping hole in what he's proposed. A significant number of buildings have both cladding and non-cladding defects, and leaseholders in them face ruinous costs to fix things like missing fire breaks and defective compartmentation. Mr. Speaker, you cannot make a building half safe.
Can I welcome these further measures to provide absolutely critical support to leaseholders and to restore a greater degree of confidence to the housing market? In particular, can I welcome the further support for those in medium-rise buildings? Of course, it's a pity that the Treasury didn't agree to that proposal in January of last year, but such is the way with this issue.
It's been almost 5 years since the Grenfell fire, and in that time we've had 4 housing secretaries and several different policies and approaches to this issue. First, the government would pay, then leaseholders would pay, and now developers will pay, all because the Treasury has for so long refused to act further on this issue.
So a flavour of that important debate on the cladding crisis. Now, the Welsh Parliament is also back from recess this week. They're sitting virtually, though, because of coronavirus. Let's talk to our reporter, Cemlyn Davis, who can tell us what's been happening. Hello to you, Cemlyn. COVID-19 has been the big issue there as well.
Yes, Joe, and in particular the restrictions that were introduced across Wales on Boxing Day in response to the Omicron variant, including a cap on the number of people who can sit together in a pub or a restaurant or a cafe, nightclubs having to close, a limit of 50 on the number of people who can take part in outdoor activities, and sporting events having to take place behind closed doors. Now, during this week's session of First Minister's Questions, the leader of the Welsh Conservative group here, Andrew R.T. Davies, expressed some concerns around a couple of these rules at least. He highlighted the fact that some popular running events have had to be cancelled because of that limit on the number of people who can take part in outdoor activities. And he also had questions about crowds not being able to attend sporting fixtures. And with rugby's Six Nation Championships around the corner, he said the Welsh Rugby Union and businesses need to know whether fans will be allowed into the Principality Stadium when Wales is due to host teams here and hold its home games. And he called on the Welsh Government to announce a plan now for easing restrictions in Wales.
Restrictions were imposed in Wales based on the modelling, and therefore you should be basing that their removal on the modelling. You have no excuses not to provide such a plan, First Minister. It is vital businesses that are feeling the pain with limits on hospitality and mental health taking a kicking with sports being scaled back, that a plan out of these restrictions is brought forward by your government.
We will follow the modelling. As I've said to him, the modelling currently shows that we are not yet at the peak of coronavirus in Wales. Now, nobody, I think, in a responsible position would argue that we should be lessening the levels of protection available here in Wales, while the numbers of people suffering from the Omicron wave is going up, not coming down. Once we are in a position where we are confident that we are past the peak and that the numbers are indeed falling, that will be the point at which we are able to set out, as of course we would want to do, a plan for reducing some of the protections that are currently in place, because then the numbers in Wales will be improving, not worsening. The model tells us that we're likely to see them worsening over the next week. And in those circumstances, it simply would not be responsible to think that this is the moment at which you would begin to remove the protections that are helping to save people from this virus, keep more people in work, lessen the pressures on the NHS. Those are the reasons we take actions here in Wales, and we will not be diverted from doing so.
The First Minister there, well, following FMQs, the Health Minister gave a statement too, updating the Senedd on the COVID situation in Wales, including the pressure on public services across Wales, and especially, of course, the NHS. Here's what she had to say.
There's some helpful evidence that Omicron is less severe than Delta, but the rise in hospital numbers and the speed at which it's travelling continues to give cause for concern. We knew the case numbers would rise very fast. We knew that this would put the NHS under pressure, and it would also put other public services under pressure and put pressure on staffing in commercial and retail businesses. The latest figures show staff absences across the NHS as a result of COVID, self-isolation and other illnesses running at just over 8% last week. But in some NHS organisations, it's more than double this. Unfortunately, this means some appointments and treatments are being postponed and staff are being transferred to work in urgent and emergency services. Other parts of the public sector have reported similar levels and are putting in motion civil contingency plans to move staff to protect essential services.
Well, later on Tuesday afternoon, the COVID restrictions were voted through retrospectively, but it's worth pointing out that they were opposed by the Conservatives and Plaid Cymru, who have a cooperation agreement, of course, with Labour. Well, they abstained on some of the restrictions as well.
Right, so that was the debate earlier in the week, Cemlyn. What's the latest on COVID restrictions in Wales?
Yes, towards the end of the week now, and yesterday the Health Minister told the Health Committee that there were some very positive signs that Wales was possibly turning the corner, and now the Welsh Government is saying that it's hoping to ease restrictions over the coming weeks and move out of Alert Level 2, where we are now, and back to Alert Level 0. The first rules to be changed will be around outdoor activities. And according to the Welsh Government, this is all because the numbers are now going in the right direction. Whilst the COVID case rates are still high, it is falling and going in the right direction. Ministers have been keeping a close eye, of course, over the data. They've been reviewing things on a weekly basis. And what they've been wanting to do is make sure that any decrease isn't a blip and isn't simply the result of a change to the rules around having to take PCR tests, for example. Well, now clearly they are confident that they're in a position now to be able to gradually ease these restrictions.
Oh, well, thank you for that, Cemlyn Davis there in Wales. Let's go to the Northern Ireland Assembly and join our reporter there, Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, we weren't expecting to see you this week. Always welcome, of course, to see you. So what's going on?
Well, thank you very much, Joe. Yes, we're here because there was a recall petition by Sinn Féin. The Assembly is still in recess, but the MLAs were back on Monday because Sinn Féin, backed by the SDLP and Alliance, had concerns about what was happening in schools here in Northern Ireland because of an alleged lack of planning to mitigate the worst effects of the Omicron surge. We do, of course, like many other places, have large levels of absence among teachers, and that, among other things, is causing huge headaches for head teachers and for schools. Now, the motion listed air ventilation as a key issue that could be used to mitigate those problems. And there was pointed criticism, therefore, of the Minister for this apparent lack of planning and indeed the fact that no request has been made for money to support putting ventilation into schools. So the debate quickly became quite political and quite heated. Here's Sinn Féin's Pat Sheehan laying out the issues as he saw them.
There's the lack of adequate cover for teachers who are absent either through the pandemic and COVID-19 or through sickness or having to care for other family members. The issue of ventilation, contingency plans for examinations, contact tracing and other potential mitigations.
I'm sure the Minister will spend wisely any money allocated by the Finance Minister. And this pan-nationalist front signing this motion, Sinn Féin, SDLP and Alliance, are the coordinating group, rather than during the pandemic wanting to work with the Minister, has sought to criticise for political advantage.
I am extremely disappointed at how this debate has went. We are talking about children and young people and their education and teachers and classrooms and all the things that are so very important at this time. And we're accused of signing a pan-nationalist motion. A pan-nationalist motion. Well, just for the member's record, Mr. Speaker, all children in Northern Ireland are affected. All teachers, all schools. Doesn't matter what walk of life. So don't try and turn something as fundamental as children's education into a sectarian argument or bun fight, because that is not what this is. This is about children's education.
All the scientific and public health advice stresses natural ventilation. Nothing is more effective than opening windows and doors. My department's COVID guidance provides schools with detailed advice on managing ventilation. This motion portrays air filters as the magic solution to ending COVID transmission in schools. This is oversimplistic and in no way reflects the complexity of the issue. At a conservative estimate, it would cost around £40 million to install them across 20,000 classrooms. If the evidence supports such investments, I will have no hesitation in bidding for such funds to the Executive and the Minister of Finance. However, I will not move ahead of the evidence and recklessly spend public money. We must follow the science.
The DUP Education Minister there, Michelle McIlveen, obviously not entirely convinced by the efficacy of mechanical ventilation to prevent the spread of Omicron, and indeed preferring the idea of natural filtration, which is opening the doors and the windows. The problem with that, of course, at this time of year, in the middle of winter, is that you have freezing classrooms and sometimes freezing pupils and freezing teachers. So the political argument rages on. She hasn't specifically asked for money yet for that investment. The Finance Minister, who is from Sinn Féin, has said he would welcome such a proposal. The executive will look at it if one does come.
Thank you very much, Jim. We've got time for one more story from Westminster. Sean, it's about the cost of living. It continues to be a major political issue. We talked about it last week on the programme. This week, Labour have again been pushing for a VAT cut on energy bills, and they were trying to use parliamentary procedure to make that happen. What was the strategy?
Yeah, this is a huge story, really, the cost of living. So I think Labour were trying to do a number of things. They had got an opposition day debate where they get to decide what to talk about. So they decided to talk about energy bills. They put forward this idea of a VAT cut. They're obviously looking to put pressure on the government over the cost of living crisis, as they described it. But they're also trying to put pressure on some Conservative MPs who they have in the past been calling for a VAT cut on fuel. But there was an interesting parliamentary moment as well, because the motion, if you like, took us back to the heady days of Brexit, because if it had gone through, it would have taken control of the Commons agenda away from the government, and it would have allowed Labour to bring forward legislation that would have cut VAT on energy bills. So it would have made the whole notion binding. It would have actually happened. So this is hugely controversial, of course, and we remember the rows back in the heights of Brexit when the Commons took control of the agenda from the government. But it was an interesting tactic because it suddenly meant that Labour were able to make their case and say, if you vote for our motion, this will actually happen. It's not just the opposition bringing forward a protest.
Prices are rising, bills are soaring, inflation is at its highest level for 3 decades. The growing cost of living crisis is leaving families across our country worse off. People deserve security, prosperity and respect.
The Labour Party has spent the last 6 years campaigning against the very ability to do what they want today, which is Brexit, right? Which is the only reason they are able to do what they want to do today. So won't you be honest with the House and say, in the heart of hearts, what if she really wanted to go back into the European Union, this one measure they're proposing wouldn't be possible, would it?
I'll say to the honourable gentleman, we want to make Brexit work. We've got this power, let's bring it in now. A VAT cut is something practical that this government can do right now, and it will be felt automatically in people's bills, in all of our constituents' bills. It will give security to people across our country.
She's making some very good points about the cost of living, but today's motion is it's got nothing to do with trying to save costs for consumers and everything to do with Labour trying to make a point about taking control of the order paper, just like they tried to do during the Brexit debate, to try and undermine the government.
This motion has clearly been put forward to seize control of parliamentary business, which we cannot and will not accept. We've all already introduced measures to support vulnerable households with the cost of energy, including increasing the warm home discount, winter fuel payments, cold weather payments, which together provided almost £2.5 billion in support to households.
What happened after the debate, Sean? Well,
The government won with a majority of 90. Only one Conservative, Anne-Marie Morris, rebelled. She said she was voting to cut VAT on fuel, but she lost the Conservative whip because the government had taken a very tough line with its own MPs, saying that they couldn't vote for a motion that would hand over control of parliamentary business to the opposition.
So what are we expecting in Westminster next week?
Well, of course, whenever we have this conversation, we don't know what urgent questions or statements might come, but there's a huge bit of government business going through the House of Lords at the moment. It's the Police, Crime and Security Bill, extremely controversial. And next week, we will come to one of the most controversial bits of this bill, when peers will be discussing and no doubt arguing about proposals to limit the right of people to protest, new restrictions on protests. And we could see some late-night votes in the House of Lords in the next few days.
That's all for this week. I will be back on Monday with Politics Live at 12:15. Do join me then. Have a very lovely weekend.